So, Greg, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about your new book, Mere Science and Christian Faith. How are you doing today?
Great. Yeah, and thanks for having me on your program.
Yeah, sure. So, EOF is all about building bridges. So, why don't we start with the premise of your book? Why do you feel science and faith can play nice?
Well, I think there are at least three reasons most people don't see a conflict between science and faith. According to some major surveys, there's a long history of Christians being involved in science, and in many ways you could argue that the development of modern science was based on Christian faith. And then third, that there are some very active scientists who are Christians involved in their work, in their scientific work today. So I can expand on any of those three items if you're interested.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I know, we could start with Mendel, who was a monk, and a lot of priests as well, that they were the original scientists. It's funny, but I would love if maybe you could take each one individually and explain, for the reader. That'd be awesome.
Well, I mean, in this book, Mere Science and Christian Faith, the main demographic I'm looking at are 18 to 30-year-olds, or what's often called emerging adults. So if you look at that particular demographic, and even a smaller slice of 18 to 23-year-olds, there was a major survey done of 11,000 undergraduates, and they asked them to complete a question or a statement. For me, the best relationship between science and faith is one of three options. The first two are conflict, basically conflict with science winning, conflict with religion being, privileged or winning, and the third being independence or collaboration. And 69%, so a large majority checked that third box for independence or collaboration. So this was just a survey of undergraduates. It wasn't necessarily any particular spiritual identification, and it demonstrates to me, with many other surveys, that most people in our country would opt for not having a conflict between religion and science. Would like them to either collaborate or see them at least playing nice together in the sandbox. And I think that's actually true even for this particular group of people that I'm interested in connecting with through this book.
Absolutely, that would be great to get connected. And science and really, in my mind, science is merely exploring the beauty of the creation.
Yep.
So there are quite a few books on this subject. I know I've read a few and interviewed a lot of authors, but they all have something different to contribute. So maybe you could tell us what makes this book a little unique.
Yeah, and I do think, of course, every author thinks that his or her book is unique. So, I guess I'm falling into that general category. There is, I think, there are some angles or an angle or two that are particular to this book. So I would say, first of all, that there are several excellent books at a kind of academic level. And I think of people like John Polkinghorne, Alistair McGrath, or Philip Clayton, who have really done some great academic work. And I think that has, and Ian Barber, who really propelled this field about 50-some years ago with his book, Issues in Science and Religion. He propelled the field of science and religion into a whole new category. So, I think there's some great academic books. This book really is designed to speak to people who are in the church, and even more particularly, I seek to address those people who are involved in ministry in the church, in Christian ministry, particularly with people who are emerging adults. So the closest book to this that I know of is Andy Root's book, Exploding Stars, Dead Dinosaurs, and Zombies, Youth Ministry in the Age of Science. And it's a great title, and it's particularly addressed to youth workers and youth. So I'm looking at just the age right after that, 18 to 30-year-olds. And what I think is a little different is, first of all, looking at that demographic. I have not seen a book on that. I've worked in the church as a pastor for almost 20 years, and I didn't really have a lot of resources to bring to that ministry of bringing together mainstream science in Mere Christianity. And this book really seeks to do that, and it seeks to do that with a significant level of engagement with social scientific literature. So I think the leading voice in the social science, or one of the two or three leading voices in the social science of the social scientific approach to science and religion, is Elaine Howard Eklund at Rice University. And I was so complimented that she said, this book represents up-to-date research. Now, Elaine is a colleague and friend, so it's really nice that she was willing to put that endorsement on the book. And I really try, especially in the first few chapters, to take in the insights of modern scientific research on 18 to 30-year-olds and apply it to this specific topic of what I call, again, bringing Mere Christianity to mainstream science. So the other angle that I think is a little different is a lot of books on religion and science, or Christian faith and science, are from scientists, which is fabulous. I mean, I think everybody should read Francis Collins' book, The Language of God. It's a great book. But I'm doing something different. I'm really speaking as a theologian who's been in conversation with scientists for the past 20 or 30 years, and saying, okay, if I look at the consensus of modern science, how does it engage with my faith as an Orthodox Christian, by which I mean Orthodox with the small o, the great consensus of Christian faith, and what is it? What does it challenge? What does it change? But what does it also support and supplement? And so I'm looking at this conversation as a theologian, from a theological perspective, and as a person who's worked in the church as a pastor.
That's wonderful. It's fabulous to try to reach that age group, and to reach them from that perspective. I know I have a science background and have enjoyed reading all of those books that you mentioned, and they speak to me. But I know at one point I was teaching the teens for Sunday school, and I was trying to break some of these things down, and so I dumbed it way down. And when I got done, my wife was teaching with me, and she's like, "Was that dumbed down?" And I'm like, "Yeah." She goes, "That was not dumbed down." It's very difficult, because a scientist kind of thinks in, well, of course you know this and you know that, or there's all this information that comes with it. So it's kind of nice to get a different view that just brings the information forward. So thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome, and I hope that the readers appreciate that. I mean, in some ways, because I'm not a specialist in science, I'm able, I hope, to have a certain filter on what and because I worked all the time in the church and still do, I'm hoping I can bring something that actually communicates to people in the pew, as it were.
So, with that being said, what was it that inspired or moved you to write Mere Science?
Well, I have an analogy when you ask me that question that goes something like this from a personal experience. I grew up in a secular environment. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is one of the least church environments in the United States. And my family was not very connected to the church. And then when I went to UC Berkeley, I became a Christian. So that should sound something like a punchline, or at least oxymoron. And when I was going to Berkeley and trying to work out a Christian faith, I was living in a fraternity, so there were these ethical challenges that were happening. Not all my fraternity brothers were excited about my newfound evangelical faith, and then there was also the challenges coming from my professors that were saying, well, kind of basically assuming that we're done with that. We're done with Christianity in the West and in Western thought. So I thought, well, one of the things I want to do is study the history of thought and the history of the way questions have been asked and responded to. And I want to study the New Testament in the ancient Greek language. So my first studies, before I got particularly into science and theology, I did ancient Greek and modern science. And modern French literature, And I looked at some of the ways that these literatures had approached great human questions, but I was particularly interested in reading the New Testament in Greek. So here's the payoff. I studied New Testament. I did an independent study at UC Berkeley with a few other students. And when I took that Greek, and then 4 years later, after doing, heading up a small business, I went to seminary, and the Greek I learned at Princeton Theological Seminary was exactly the same Greek that I learned at this beautiful and fabulous secular university, University of California, Berkeley. And it struck me when I think about this that we trusted a secular campus to teach me the Greek that works with the most revered texts we have, the most authoritative texts we have as Christians. But so often in the church and in seminaries, we hear that the science we take from places like Berkeley or Cal State Chico, where I teach, or Columbia, where my daughter went to school, and we say that science is wrong. It's not the science that we can take up with our theological reflection. And I think that's honestly really detrimental to our faith. So I wanted Christians that I'm connecting with to say, well, what if we do take up the great consensus of mainstream science, it's held by 98% of scientists, and take it and look at it and see what it means for our faith. And I think the payoff is profound, and I think the payoff for the mission of the church is profound.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. So back to the book itself, if you had to boil it down to a couple of points, what would the most important ones be for the reader to have when they were finished with the book?
I would love it if people would come away with a conviction that there's some very worthwhile, it's very worthwhile to bring together mere Christianity with mainstream science. That they would say, well, I'm convinced this is an important thing. I talk about this book being a manifesto and a field guide. The manifesto part, I'm trying to, give a little rhetorical flourish for why this is an important task. And then that there are three basic subpoints after that. First, that mainstream science can challenge but also enhance our faith. And this is based on the long-standing vision that Christians have had of reading the two books of God. There's the book of nature and the book of Scripture that are not the same, but that complement each other because they have the same author. So that's one. That's the first thing, the first subpoint. The second is that there are significant issues the church needs to take up, especially when we listen to the voices of 18 to 30-year-olds in the areas of science and technology, the areas of sexuality, the areas of climate change. There are these issues that I think the church, if it doesn't take it up, and this is basically my third point, will begin and increasingly lose people. David Kinnaman, in his research that led to the book, You Lost Me, found that there were 6 main reasons why 18 to 29-year-olds, that was his study, were leaving the church and never coming back in its doors. And of those 6 main reasons, one was that the church was perceived as being anti-science. So as a person who had most of my pastoral ministry with college or post-college people whom I love, I'm concerned that if the church doesn't take up the issues of science and technology, we're going to continue to see this exodus among emerging adults. And it'll lead ultimately to the kind of increase in the not religiously affiliating that we're seeing, where 35 to 40% of emerging adults are not affiliating with any religious tradition, which primarily in our country means Christianity. So, I think it's those three things. It's that we need to take up issues of technology and sexuality and climate change, that mainstream science actually enhances our faith, even while it challenges it at some points, and that this is a task, I believe, that's important for the mission of the gospel, the task being to engage our faith with the findings of science.
Well, that's a big deliverable, but I hope that the book carries that off and other people are inspired by what you're presenting to them and what we need to do to hang on to those people and keep them close to God.
Yeah, I think that's right. If I just would add one thing, it's that I think, in this book I realized that I'm not going to speak to everybody. And there's people who, for example, will hold to scientific convictions that don't hold up with the consensus of science. So I don't know that I'm going to speak to them, but I want to speak to the thoughtful Orthodox and evangelical crowd, the people who would read the Nicene and Apostles' Creed and say, yes, that's what I believe, and bring, various insights from, say, geology, biology, neuroscience, cognitive science, physics, etc., and say, here is the way that your faith can be enhanced by these insights. And I want to speak to that. It's a strategic, to that group of people. It's a strategic demographic that I'm after in seeking to speak to. And I think that's where some change can occur. I think there's a real openness to seeing what this is about.
Absolutely. So, you mentioned that you teach at Chico State, but you're also the Director of Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries at Fuller Theological Seminary. Perhaps you could tell the reader a little bit about that project?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm essentially close to half-time as a lecturer at Chico State, I live in the city of Chico, which is north of Sacramento. And then I also, with most of my time, manage a project that's housed at the STAR office, which is the Science and Theology Advanced Research Office at Fuller Theological Seminary. And so I have a 3-year grant that's funded by the Templeton Foundation to bring together science and faith for 18 to 30-year-olds, and particularly to resource Christian ministries that are caring and ministering with this particular age group, and to give them resources to bring science to faith, to have a more science-friendly faith. So what does that look like? Well, it's an intervarsity ministry at Columbia University or NYU in New York City. It's a Lutheran church that has a great campus ministry near UNC Chapel Hill. It's a mega church in Massachusetts, Grace Chapel, that has an amazing internet outreach called GC Science, and has these conversations with its scientists in its congregation, people from MIT and Harvard. It's this self-standing Christian ministry called Upper House at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that partners with an EV-free church there in Madison to bring together a lot of cultural issues with faith, but part of it is science. So we have given grants to them, sub-grants, as it's called, and then resources. And it's a 3-year project, and as we're speaking, we're in the 3rd year of that project, with the hope that these initiatives will be catalyzed in the ministries for years to come. The most important part of STEAM, which is Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries, this project I run, and by the way, you can look it up on the web at thesteamproject.org if you want to look at it more. We realized that it's so important to be relational in the way we do this work. So we always have paired a ministry leader, not just a pastor, but sometimes pastors, with scientists as leaders in these projects. So it goes like this. If you're in a church and you have Beth, who's a biologist, and she's also the youth group leader for the youth group leader, and you know that you can trust her, that you can say her faith in Jesus Christ is vibrant, her belief in the importance of Scripture is solid, then when she starts talking about her scientific work and her understanding of evolution, you're going to listen in a new way, and you're going to trust in a new way. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll subscribe to all the elements of evolutionary theory, but you'll begin to see that this is not some kind of subversive anti-Christian, propaganda. Hearing from this imaginative, parabolic person, Beth, is different from hearing evolution from Richard Dawkins or Jerry Coyne. So I think there's a certain importance to the relationships. And I also believe that in this particular age group, there's an openness to science that perhaps people of my age group didn't have so much, and especially technology, science and technology. So there's an openness, but I think there's a concern that the church isn't responding well, and my hope is to change that. and to change it, I hope, for the better and for the sake of the gospel.
Absolutely. You're doing wonderful work, and I hope you continue with it and possibly write more books as well. And just thank you for all the things you do.
Well, I really appreciate being on your program. I love the work that you do, and I do hope that there will be people who will be inspired through Mere Science and Christian Faith, and will find that their faith is really enhanced through hearing about the way to bring together these ways that God has spoken, through the glories of creation and nature that scientists study, and through the glories of Scripture that we all study as Christians.